Thank you for joining us today for our JINSA program. We are honored to have joining us today Danielle Pletka, John Hanna, and Blaise Mistel. Danielle Pletka is a distinguished senior fellow at American Enterprise Institute. John Hanna is a senior fellow at JINSA's Gamunder Center for Defense and Strategy. And this program will be moderated by Blaise Mistel, Vice President of Policy at JINSA. Our distinguished panel will be discussing armed and desperate, Iranian proxies in Iraq. During the webinar, you may submit questions through the Q&A box on your screen. For those in the audience, you're automatically muted and your video is off. I would like to invite Blaise to start this discussion.
Thank you, Harris, and thank you everyone who's joining us today, and thank you in particular to our panelists, John and Danny. It's really a great pleasure to be talking with you. As I'm sure everyone in our audience knows, John and Danny are really leading lights in the foreign policy firmament, not just as thinkers, but also as practitioners. They've been people who I've long admired and tried to model my career on, so it's great to be talking with you. The proximate cause of our conversation today is the drone attack that happened on the residence of Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi earlier this week. An attempt at assassinating him, it would appear, and trying to understand what that attack means, why it happened, and what it portends both for the future of Iraqi politics, for Iran's attempt to dominate the region, and how that might have implications for the United States and what the US should be doing to respond. I wanted to start our conversation talking about the attack itself, what we know about it, and sort of what has happened in the several days since it happened, and then maybe go back in time to try to unravel some of the causes for that attack, then before trying to dive into more analysis about what it might mean for Iraq and the region. We'll have a conversation with our panelists for roughly the next 35 minutes or so. And then I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. You can use the questions feature on Zoom to submit written questions, which I'll then read out to our panelists. So John, let me start with you, and maybe can you give us a rundown of what exactly happened at Prime Minister Kadhimi's residence? What do we know?
Right, great. Blaise, thank you, and thank you to Danny. It's terrific to see Danny. She's been a long time friend and colleague in Washington, and just one of the smartest and sharpest people in town. So it's great to be on this panel with her. So on, I think the early hours of Sunday morning, apparently up to 3 armed drones were flown into the protected green zone of Baghdad, the capital, which is where all the government offices, embassies, and obviously the prime minister's residence are. At least one of those drones managed to drop its payload onto Kadhimi's house, injuring 7 of his guards, and apparently slightly injuring the prime minister himself. Iran and its proxies, it's not like they haven't killed slews of people across the Middle East over the years, including, everybody should remember, in 2005, I believe it was, the Lebanese prime minister, Rafiq Hariri, via their proxy Hezbollah in Lebanon. So while this was a shocking escalation inside of Iraq, I'm not sure it was completely outside the range of Iran's and its proxies' normal activities across the Middle East to protect their what they see as their vital interests and prerogatives in a number of these states that they've really burrowed into and penetrated. In the aftermath of the attack, you saw widespread condemnation, both largely within Iraqi politics, as well as from the international community. I would say from the most likely suspects themselves, some of these powerful Iraqi militias that are backed by Iran, they also said that they weren't responsible for the attack, although they tried to shift blame off to third parties and to the United States in particular for undertaking kind of a false flag operation in order to bolster the prime minister's credentials. Interestingly, although not unusually, the first person from abroad on the scene in Baghdad after the attack was Ismail Khani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Quds Force, who's the primary patron of these Iraqi militias. And you just have to think how strange that is to have a foreign special operations officer just within hours be able to come into that country and see and talk to everybody when everybody in that country suspects and believes that Iran's proxies were probably behind this attack on their prime minister. Just goes to show you how serious and concerning a situation we have in Iraq. Khani showed up, exactly what he did, what he told the proxies. He certainly said Iran was not responsible. It was probably third party, could be Americans, could be foreign think tanks even. I don't know, Danny, we'll have to ask you about that. And he expressed support for the Iraqi government and for some form of de-escalation. But all of this kind of plausible deniability, we have to say, is entirely in keeping with Iran's modus operandi throughout the region and its use and manipulation of these foreign proxies for years and years now. So this is, in some ways, if it was Iran, it's very much business as usual for them.
Thanks, John. So let me turn to you, Danny, and at John's urging, ask what you know about who the perpetrators were. But it's more importantly, the assumption is, as John said, that these were Iranian-backed and supported and armed militias that carried out the attack. But given the wide range of denials that we've heard, could it have been someone else? And if it was these militias, do we suspect they were acting on Iranian orders? Could they have been sort of freelancing? What are the different options here, and what do we think is most likely?
Thank you, Blaise. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It really, John was so gracious. You both were so gracious. It really is an honor for me to sit with the both of you, who I respect and am enormously fond of. It's nice to be with people you like in Washington because, there just aren't that many. But I know I caught that little think tank quip coming from the Iranians, but it didn't just come from the Iranians. So, I think John laid out exactly what happened. But if you look at the response to the attack, which really was one of the most brazen attacks on the Iraqi Prime Minister, on Mustafa Kadhimi, that we've seen. He's been targeted before, probably by the same people. This is how they make leverage for themselves. But at the same time, this was one of the most brazen and very dangerous attacks. And I want to come back to the nature of the attack in a second. But what was interesting to us, and we not just at AEI, but at Kim Kagan's Institute for the Study of War, which pays a lot of attention to really what's happening on the ground inside Iraq, was the unbelievable similarity of the responses on the part of both the Iranians, the Hashd Shabi, the popular mobilization units, which are the Iranian quote unquote militias, really a Hezbollah model that we see in Iraq, and their other friends in the region. So you really saw them come out of the box very quickly, deny responsibility, and sort of try to muddy the waters about who is responsible. Now, if you just pause for a second, because let's face it, that Mustafa Kadhimi is probably vastly unknown to the mass of Americans. Why is this important for Iraq, why is this important for us? But why does this also give us insight into how Iran operates? Remember, in the tanker attacks that Iran perpetrated on Gulf shipping, they've now shifted from Gulf shipping because they're trying to make nice with some of the Gulf countries, but they've now shifted to attacks on Israeli or Israeli affiliated or owned shipping. What their aim is never to deny responsibility completely. It's to raise questions in people's minds about who is responsible, because our focus is just that, that 2 minutes after it happened, and the Iranians are always busy pointing in other directions. That's their MO. That's how they do business. Understanding that in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, nobody's going to remember that it happened. Nobody's going to care. That is their business. So I think that's very important to understand. And I think that gives us a sense that this was definitely Iranian government sanctioned. The question for many of us who know Mustafa Kadhimi, who is the incumbent prime minister and likely to be the prime minister that comes out of these elections that took place in October in Iraq, is why would the Iranians allow their proxies in Iraq to target him? Because he is widely viewed to be someone with whom, let's just say, the Iranians are comfortable. The Iranians, I think, feel that he is a weak compromise figure. Now, I have known him for 30 years and I love him, but I probably shouldn't say that. That's probably bad for him. But I think he's not considered the strongest. He doesn't have a political constituency. He certainly doesn't have anything other than the instruments of state at his hands in Iraq. So why did they do this? What are they maneuvering around about? And as we were chatting about this in the run-up, I think, again, one of the things we absolutely have to understand about Iran is, unlike us, they come to work every single day. They are focused and they have a broad, integrated regional soft and hard power strategy. So when you see something like this happen in Baghdad, you have to ask yourself, what else is going on? Because it's not just in the context of Baghdad. Sure, there are some Iraqi politics going on that I think would be worth talking about, and I'm going to shut up in just 10 seconds. But I think it's important to understand that there was an attack on our embassy in Yemen. That is 100% going to be Iranian backed, because they are the power broker inside Yemen at this point. We then see an escalation of Iranian exports to Syria for Hezbollah, and of course, those of us without security clearances don't necessarily know that's happening. We just see the up tempo in Israeli strikes on Syria against Iranian targets, Iranian imports, and Iranian-backed terrorists. All of this is going on, and what's happening at the end of the month? Not just Thanksgiving. No, in fact, a whole other group of turkeys are going to meet in in Europe. The Iranians, the Europeans, and the Biden administration are going to be meeting again in the first JCPOA resurrection talks of the new administration in Iran. They think about all of that together, and I think we have to see Iraq in that context. Okay, now I'm done.
Thanks, Danny. So before we go back to talk about some of the October election in Iraq and sort of where Iraqi politics is, and maybe go forward and see what Iran's broader endgame in the region might be, and with the nuclear negotiations, John, just let me ask you sort of, what's your read on maybe what Iran was hoping to get out of this attack? Was it a miscalculation on their part? Was it a conscious and deliberate escalation? Given how quickly Khani was there, was that the purpose of the attack, or is that evidence that maybe they didn't realize how damaging it might be to their position in Iraq? How should we understand it?
I can't claim to know. I mean, and I know Danny's very certain about her assessment and analysis, and I tend to that side. But there are a lot of really good Iraq analysts who believe that that Iran wasn't aware that this attack was going to go on, would have opposed it if they had known about it, and felt afterwards that it had gone way too far and crossed a red line and came down quite hard against some of its proxies, trying to rein them in, because of a fear that this could have led, if Khatami had been killed, to some form of an intra-Shiite civil war collapse of any kind of government structures in Iraq, and then an entire mess that Iran would have to deal with. Again, I think the involvement, likely involvement of the Kataib Hezbollah, which is the closest Iranian proxy in Iraq, their involvement in this attack, the fact that it involved multiple drones, multiple armed drones, the fact that it occurred a day or two after a very violent protest organized by pro-Iranian groups to protest the elections that tried to storm the green zone, in which at least one, if not several, of these pro-Iran militiamen were killed. And you had the leaders of some Iranian proxies in Iraq swearing that there would be blood for blood extracted from the prime minister for killing those, for allowing those protesters to be killed with live fire. All of that leads me to believe that the Iranians were at a minimum aware of this, allowed it to occur, if they didn't actually direct it. And their purpose here, I think, yes, there may be a broad, global, comprehensive strategy, but it's also very, very much about Iraq. Iraq, perhaps even more than Lebanon right now, Iranian control and influence and penetration of Iraq is the crown jewel in Iran's Shiite empire across the Middle East that they're trying to establish. It's 40 million people. It's a huge amount of territory that gives them strategic depth and ensures that another horrible Iran-Iraq war will never be allowed to happen. So I think for them, all of this violence and protests after the elections is a result of the fact that the most pro-Iran elements in these elections really took a drubbing. They did very, very poorly, lost up to 2/3 of their seats. There is a great danger in their mind that the other parties will now try and organize a new government in Iraq that not only has Khademi at the top of it, but excludes the most pro-Iran elements from the government in a way that would dramatically circumscribe Iran's influence in the country and its ability and the ability of its proxies to really extract all of Iraq's wealth by controlling various ministries and patronage networks and having vast monopolies to sell goods into the Iraqi economy and to earn dollars out of the Iraqi economy that they can use for other nefarious purposes. So I think that this kind of risk-taking is very much in keeping with Iran's, what they see as the stakes involved for them in Iraq, the possibility that they could be excluded from any new government. And they wanted to make sure that everybody understood that if they are not included, if their proxies are not extremely powerful in that government, despite not having succeeded in the elections, that they're prepared to burn the government down. I think also yes, they were important in getting Khademi into office in 2020, but I think he's developed as a bit of a thorn in their side. He has periodically, not with great success, but challenged Iran's militias and paid a price for doing that at times, with all kinds of threats being posed against his personal safety. He's tried to shut down some of their opportunities to earn revenues by controlling borders and controlling smuggling routes in Iraq. And Khademi, it has to be said, is all too willing to allow the United States and American military forces to remain in Iraq for what seems like an indefinite period of time. He'll change the label that they're no longer involved in combat operations in Iraq. They're simply assisting the Iraqi army and security forces in building up their capabilities in a training and supply mission. But for the Iranians, they want America out of Iraq. Their proxies want American forces out of Iraq. It's if not the highest, it's a very, very high priority for the Iranians. And there is no sign that Khatami is prepared, or a lot of other Iraqis are prepared to go along with that program. But I do believe that at this point in time, the real red line, making sure their parties, no matter how poorly they're fared in the elections, remain a very powerful force in the Iraqi government. But a secondary goal, get rid of Khatami. He's gotten, he's a little too troublesome. He's not really worth it. Let's figure out to get some other compromise candidate in there who may get the message and go along a little more smoothly with the Iranian program in Iraq.
Thanks, John. So Danny wanted to go back to the, I believe, October 10th election with you and unpack a little more. As John said, in that election, the Shiite Iran-backed parties seem to have been the big losers. But if we could unpack a little more, who were the winners, and in particular, what's going to be the role? I think one of the main figures that came out of this as a winner was Muqtada al-Sadr. How's that going to play out? He's had sort of a shifting role in Iraqi politics and sort of at various times been more of an opponent of the U.S. presence. Now he's described more as a nationalist. What exactly does that mean in the spectrum of Iraqi politics? And I guess also given the sectarian split in Iraq, do we see the Iranian threat here from the Shiite parties as being persuasive and sort of getting Sunnis and Sadr to include them in the government, or is it going to steal their backbone and sort of create the possibility of a backlash against this Iranian presence?
That is a really hard question to answer. First of all, because I'm not a psychoanalyst, and I think every time you talk about Muqtada al-Sadr, you feel like you really need to be, because understanding him, his motivations, and his various positions over the years is really hard. But I think that you put your finger on the main point here, which is Muqtada did really well, better than in the last election. Now, again, this was a very low participation election for a whole variety of reasons, but Muqtada did very well, and Iran's proxies did not do well and lost seats. I think you can't see what's going on in Iraqi politics outside the context of what has been happening over the last couple of years in the region. Right before COVID, we've had this interval of this sort of odd, interregnum in which everything has been frozen in time. But right before that, there were demonstrations, anti-government demonstrations, I should add, not just in Iraq that brought down the previous government, but also in Lebanon that brought down the government, and elsewhere throughout the region. And these were not unlike the rent-a-crowd that we are so used to seeing in the Middle East, and frankly in so many other places, these were not rent-a-crowd demonstrations. These were anti-corruption demonstrations. They were mostly about services, all the boring stuff of governance, electricity, water, hospitals, roads, schools, those sorts of things. And there they have absolute reason to be dissatisfied in Iraq. The previous government fell, Mustafa Kadhimi ended up in place, but the reality is, of course, that the Iraqi political system is a spoils system. The UN, in its wisdom, decided that when they wanted to put a political system up for Iraq, they should have the same one that Italy and Israel has, because that's led to so much political stability over the last 50 years. And as a result, the structure is such that the parties that are involved in the coalitions divide the spoils, and they have been much as you would expect them to be in that part of the world, unbelievable grifters who have been more focused on handing out contracts and less focused on delivering services. I think that that has now morphed into a politically dominated crowd of demonstrations. So John mentioned that outside the Green Zone, there was a particularly violent demonstration. The Iraqi security forces, or people who may be the Iraqi security forces, or people who may be in the Iraqi security forces but are answering to other commanders who do not have Iraq's national best interests at heart, have shot live fire. When I was in Baghdad in June, 2 people were killed in demonstrations right outside the Green Zone. Kadhimi was widely vilified by the demonstrators and blamed. Is he to blame? Well, he's the boss. But in any case, it's interesting that all of this shook out in a way that ended up with him coming back to power. You know, I think whenever you analyze the elections, and we can talk about the various small parties that prospered and the various other parties that didn't prosper, but that's not ultimately fascinating to most American audiences. What I think is interesting is that Iran, despite its dominance, right, despite the fact that Khamenei can show up at the prime minister of Iraq's house immediately in the wake of a drone attack, and nobody thinks to themselves, what's that about? Despite that fact, I think there remains enormous antipathy towards Iran. And this is one of the reasons why Muqtada Assad prospered. It's also one of the reasons why Muqtada has backed Mustafa Kadhimi. And it is a sign of hope for us. The problem for the United States as we look at this political scenario is that we do not in any way have our eye on the ball. We have one person who's sort of in charge of all of this, Brett McGurk, who's well known to all of us. And the Biden administration's main ambition here is to A, propitiate Iran, and B, get the hell out of Dodge, right? We pulled out of Afghanistan. There is certainly word on the street that we want to pull out of Syria.
Danny, we lost your audio for some reason.
Because my AirPods suck. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
There you go. I think the only reason we haven't pulled out of Iraq, frankly, is because Joe Biden remembers what happened when Barack Obama pulled out of Iraq, which was a massive war and a takeover by.
So, you know, all of these things are at play.
We've lost you again.
Sorry.
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm turning off my Bluetooth. Hopefully that will fix everything. But what I was saying is, but I think that you know, even our commitment to our presence in Iraq is very tenuous, and there's a lot at risk. There was a major ISIS attack inside Iraq just in the last couple of days. So, you know, very unstable, and the Iranians are playing games while the Iraqis really can't stand up to them, and we are not backstopping them.
So on that point, John, how do you see the Kadhimi government or Iraq responding to these brazen attacks? Is there going to be any chance of bringing the perpetrators to justice? We've seen Kadhimi try at various points to rein in the Iranian-backed militias. He's arrested leaders at times only to let them go several days later. But given that this was a direct attack against him, is there going to be more of a response, or is it going to be more of the same, do you think?
If I had to bet, I'd say more of the same. You know, there's been talk that there will be kind of mutual investigations. One, an investigation of what happened on at the Green Zone a week ago, and who actually, which soldiers or troops or forces fired live fire at demonstrators, engaged in, you know, large-scale violence, throwing objects at the forces. But to hold somebody to account there, operating at the front lines, trying to protect the Green Zone. And at the same time, there will be some kind of investigation of who is behind these drone attacks on the prime minister, and perhaps a couple of Kataib Hezbollah or Asab al-Haq militiamen will be locked up for a few days or weeks or months in their homes or in a popular mobilization force facility. So I don't really expect much to change. And I would say, if you forced me to bet right now, I would say that if there was any thought on the part of Muqtada or Kadhimi or Masoud Barzani or any of the independents who were elected who managed to get elected in these recent elections to form what we call a majority government that does actually exclude certain parties who didn't do very well or who are pursuing a political and military program that's in contradiction to the best interests of the Iraqi state, that those people, the militias, would be left out of government. I think that the chances now of that kind of majority government being created were probably not very high in the first place, but I think they're probably, getting very close to zero now, that there will be a consensus that we have walked right up to the edge now of full-scale warfare between elements within the Shiite community, that is too risky, that is too high a price to pay for the Iraqi state to return to something that begins to look like a civil war, particularly within the Shiite community, that the Grand Ayatollah, the main religious figure in Iraq, Ayatollah Sistani, probably doesn't want to see that happen, as much as he's not a fan of Iran and their militias. But he doesn't want to see Shiite power in Iraq come under threat and Shiites at each other's throats militarily. And at the end of the day, this group Fatah, the militia group, as well as people like the former very, very highly sectarian Shiite Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, who, while the militias did badly in the elections, Maliki actually gained up to 10, 11, 12 seats and is going to be a powerful force potentially, that all of those Iranian allies are going to end up in some way or shape or form having a claim inside of this Iraqi government. You're going to have another consensus government that includes most of the Shiite parties who have been raping the Iraqi state for the last several years. The militias will continue to exist. They will continue to get, $1 billion, $2 billion a year directly out of the Iraqi budget, and they'll continue to probably up their attacks to eventually test Joe Biden, his patience, his stomach for staying in Iraq, and drive the price up too high and get American forces out of Iraq eventually. So, it's a very pessimistic picture I've got. I can see ways it wouldn't happen that way, but we'd really have to, get some very lucky cards to have it play out that way. And I think the odds are much greater that whatever has happened over the course of the last week in terms of this escalation of violence, that the Iranians will end up protecting their prerogatives inside of Iraq by having their proxies and puppets and allies in quite powerful positions inside of the Iraqi government rather than outside having their power circumscribed. I hope I'm wrong, but that's my current take.
Danny, wanted to get your view on sort of where you see Iraq going next. But first, let me remind our audience that if they have questions, they can submit them using the Q&A button on their Zoom app, and we'll get to those in just a couple of minutes. But first, Danny, do you share the sort of the pessimistic assessment here from John? Do you think there's a possibility of some extremely delicate modus vivendi emerging between the different groupings in Iraq? And let me add to this, because John mentioned it. We actually saw a sort of a decline for the most part in attacks against U.S. personnel in Iraq by Iranian-backed groups in the lead up to the elections. Do we think those are going to ramp up again? Is the focus going to be more on intra-Iraqi violence? Or where do you see that going?
So I don't like to say this. I don't like to admit this even to myself, but I do agree with John, not because I hate to agree with John, but because I agree with his pessimistic assessment. Look, the problem for us is that if Iran didn't exist, let's say, or Iran were governed by a decent regime, decent system, I think Iraq has a chance. I think the Iraqi people are enormously educated. I think actually they I think they want a democratic system. They have a very vibrant civil society. They really do. And you know, just as an aside, I was visiting with an old friend of ours who's the head of the Iraqi National Trade Bank, where lots of Iranian money is now frozen, and another old friend dropped by who's a businessman who, you know, is in Iraq, he lives in London, he comes back and forth. And I said, God, you know, things are so bad. And he said, you know, private sector, things are going great. You know, we've got tons and tons of business. We've got startups. We've got really, really exciting young people. And that's all great. We don't see that. And obviously the operating environment for those people is not optimal. And the problem, again, you know, we come back to this, is Iran. No, Iran does not seek stability in its neighbors. Iran seeks instability. Iran is not like the Soviet Union, in which it, you know, hopes to install its puppet to govern that place and do its bidding. That's not its game. That kind of governance is hard, and the Iranians, I think, have rightly assessed, you know, why would we want to do that when we can just keep poking at everything and create that instability that not just keeps Iraq off balance, but obviously worries Iraq's neighbors elsewhere, you know, has serious implications for the Gulf, has implications for oil markets, has implications for the United States, draws in the Russians and the Chinese. That's their game. And so even if the Iraqis were the best and didn't have all of these awful proxy militias and these proxy political parties and these proto-Hezbollahs, they've got this problem on their border. And I think that is the long-term problem. Again, you know, could we beat that? Could we actually, if the United States had a serious Iraq policy, if the United States did not hesitate about picking, you know, some better people to work with, could we turn that around? I think we could certainly increase the odds of a more stable future for Iraq, but we're not there. We don't have that capacity. We don't have that interest. Iraq is a dirty word in Washington. And so that's the challenge long-term for Iraq. On the other side, you asked this question about why it is that our embassy has not been targeted, that our personnel have not been targeted. And the short answer to that is we are in this little lull before we get back to the JCPOA talks. And I think that the Iranians do not want to put their let's say, wannabe friend, Joe Biden, in a difficult position. And if they do, which they have in the last year or so, put him in a difficult position and forced us into airstrikes against their proxies, if they do, they recognize it's going to have some blowback for the talks. So I'd say this is, you know, a little bit of calm before the storm when everything goes to hell in a handbasket.
Although, Blaise, if I can just cut in, because
sure.
I think it's certainly right empirically that inside of Iraq, after I believe it was July, when they seemed to have shifted course a little bit, when we had some of the last major attacks in Iraq, that there was this pause now for multiple months in the lead up to the elections as they tried to figure out how to actually win these elections, and they weren't able to do it. Their campaign strategy was a disaster. Having said that, though, we have had an attack on the Mercer Street on the Israeli affiliated tanker that killed 2 Western nationals with no response. We had, just in the space of the last month, an attack on Tamph directly on an American base in southern Syria, a crucial base in blocking the establishment full-fledged of an Iranian land bridge to Syria and Lebanon. That attack, a multi-drone attack that everybody knows, and it's been determined, I think, by the United States military that Iran was responsible for that. And that, of course, has occurred in this period as well. Some pretty brazen attacks, some that of a nature that haven't happened in quite a long time, particularly the one in Tamph in Syria, directly on U.S. forces by Iran and its proxies. Again, without any kind of U.S. response. And so, exactly what their game is in the wider region, I'm not sure if I see them really pulling back. Again, in Iraq, I think they kind of made a different calculation in the last several months about whatever interest they had in not going after the Americans and making life really difficult. But again, I don't expect that to last very long. Let me just say, because I was so pessimistic in the beginning, to return to something Danny kind of mentioned, which is a bright spot in these elections, even though turnout was abysmal. And I'm not sure turnout can get too much worse going forward. If there's a sixth Iraqi national election in 4 years and you get turnout down in the 20%, then I think Iraq's democracy and the legitimacy of it is really going to fall into question. But even with that abysmal turnout, even with 30 assassinations occurring of political figures and activists in the lead up to these elections by the Iranians and their proxies, that the protest party, the one for sure protest party made up of protesters who were not only against all the misery and pathologies of the Iraqi state and political system, but also pretty fed up with Iran's role in Iraqi society, won something like 9 or 10 seats, a very good chunk of seats, which was quite remarkable. And I'm not sure anybody anticipated that those young people would have been as brave to actually stand and run and do as well as they did. Then on top of that, we have a whole slew of other new faces and parties and so-called independents, up to 30, 40 independents who won seats in their individual districts that I'm not sure we have a full knowledge and rundown of what their political affiliations may be. Some of them could well end up being pro-Iran or being able to have, be rented or bought by pro-Iranian forces, but some of them may also be out of this larger protest movement that erupted in 2019, who are determined to form a real credible opposition within the Iraqi parliament and to pursue their program of reforming the Iraqi political system and the Iraqi state and to end corruption and to limit and constrain foreign influence in Iraq. So, there are these shoots of flowers kind of that we see emerging in this garden of weeds that's been the Iraqi political system. They would take, I think, a lot more time to develop and be able to have a real impact on how awful this political system is. But it is something that if you're thinking long term, it's these young people, these activists, these very brave and courageous people who were killed by the hundreds during the protests by pro-Iran militias and government forces. That they, if they're able to somehow continue to exist and slowly build their power in some kind of popular base and have, subtle, nuanced, but effective Western and international support, maybe that's a cause for optimism if in fact the Iranians and their allies aren't able to turn Iraq into a full-fledged Hezbollah state over the next 5 years, let's say.
And it is remarkable, as Danny noted, that we've had these wave of protests sort of across the Iranian, not governed, but controlled swath of the Middle East and Lebanon and Iraq and Iran itself. I hope you're right, John, that this is sort of a patch of flowers and otherwise a weed garden. And, Danny, be interested in your thoughts on what we could be doing to support those. But let me also ask you about this dissonance that John noted between continued Iranian aggression around the region against U.S. personnel, most recently with the seizure of the U.S. embassy in Yemen, and relative quiet in Iraq itself. What are we to make of that? Does that mean that the Iranians somehow think that we're more likely to connect violence against us in Iraq to or react to it or connect it to nuclear negotiations? They feel that they can do it in Syria or Yemen or at sea with sort of more impunity, or is there a strategy here? Are they connected, or are these sort of disparate local issues that are playing out?
So there are two questions there: the patch of flowers and the what the hell are the Iranians up to? And I agree with John that that they are a patch of flowers. The problem is we met with my colleague Ken Pollock and I were in Iraq in June, and we met with a few folks, although not enough, because our second meeting ended up having to be canceled because we were under threat and couldn't leave the green zone. Yeah, that was fun, but we met with them, and I guess, look, the biggest problem with these groups is what they need is they need outside parties to help them think about the challenge that they face. Yes, it's great. I'm really happy to see them get a vote of confidence, even if it's a protest vote in the Iraqi elections themselves. But they tend to, and I'm very familiar with these groups in Lebanon, where they've popped up, again, for very organic, intrinsic, domestic reasons, right? The group in Beirut that won municipal elections after they organized protests because there was no trash pickup for a year. These groups have lots of potential, but they need help. They need technical support, they need guidance, and they need advisors. And the reason I say that is because the guys in Iraq, they're idealistic, they're angry, and they're rightly angry about their confrontations with the security forces, but they're entirely focused on Kadhimi. And I say that not because I like him and he's my friend. I say that because he is not the problem. The problem is somewhere else. And they're 100%ers. These are guys who, you've got to go. It's like, who's your candidate instead? Who do you want better? Who would you want who's more realistic? And they don't think about the challenges that face them that way. And that's always very problematic. And if we were doing something great with all that money that we give to the International Republican Institute, the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, these are the guys who I think need the support. And of course, lots of those groups can't operate because of the security environment in places like Iraq and are under threat themselves. But that's what they need. They need help becoming better, more serious political parties, more realistic negotiators, with real leaders who can be candidates for actual leadership. Otherwise, you end up having everything like what happened in Egypt in Tahrir Square in 2011, which is that you have these very, very idealistic, secular liberals who come out and demonstrate, and then when push comes to shove, they get totally crowded out by the Muslim Brotherhood because the Muslim Brotherhood has got political game, and they don't have any. So this is a challenge throughout the region, and it's one that John's worked on for years, I've cared about for years, and it remains a very, very serious challenge. And that's what I would say about these guys, having talked to them, and they are very idealistic, they're trying really hard, but I don't think that they're going to win a lot of ground, because I think a lot of their asks are not terribly pertinent to the future of Iraq. So that's them on one side. On the other side, and Ken Pollock may disagree with me about this, by the way, who's somebody really smart to talk to on these topics, who's also at AEI with me. On the second question, just very briefly, John demurred at my certitude about the attack on Mustafa Kadhimi's house. My dad always used to say about me, often in error, but never in doubt. And I think that the challenge that we face in what's going on with the Houthis and what was going on with the Mercer Street, the attack on this Israeli-owned shipping by the Houthis, is we don't exactly know what's happening. We don't exactly know how day-to-day the Iranian control of those acts is. Did someone in Tehran say, do this? Or did somebody who is a Tehran proxy decide to take the reins and move themselves? I think in Iraq, you see a lot more pinpointed control. I think you see a lot more Iraqi presence. Khaani is not spending his time in Yemen. He is spending his time in Iraq. So I think it's much harder for us to know. I hope our intelligence community is aware, but again, I wouldn't obsess too much about did they order it or didn't they order it? Because that's the road we used to go down in the old days when we used to pretend that Iran wasn't behind all the terrorist attacks that were happening. The answer is their proxies have a certain amount of free reign. Their proxies know who the enemy is. Sometimes they go too far, but they rarely get seriously smacked down. Did Iran order it specifically or not? We don't know exactly, but it doesn't matter that much, in my opinion.
So with about 8 minutes that we have remaining, wanted to ask both of you to quickly sort of give your recommendations for the U.S. government on how to deal with this thicket of problems, from the attack on Khatami, sort of what should our role in Iraq be, to the broader regional aggression that we see from Iran, from Tanf to the embassy in Sana'a, to the nuclear negotiations that we're heading into. Hopefully not too drowsy from all the Turkey will be having ahead of time. Should we be treating all of these as connected? Should we be retaliating? Is that our role? Would it be helpful for the Iraqis and Khatami if we were involved in trying to respond to the attack on him? What should the U.S. do? John, let me start with you.
Okay, thanks, Blaise. My preference would be that Khatami and the Iraqi government and the counterterrorism services kind of saw this as the kind of challenge it is to them, and were prepared now to come to us and to come to others in the region and the international community and say, hey, I can't let this stand. I need to respond to this. I really need to take these armed militias down a major notch. And, I'm going to need your support when I do that, because it's not going to be, one and done. This is going to play out over time, and it could get very nasty and dirty. We're prepared to be at the front lines doing the work here, but we really are going to need your backing and support, whether that's in the form of intelligence or logistics or weapons, and even possibly airstrikes, but to do that in conjunction with a sovereign Iraqi government. I think, if the Iraqi government decides that it's either include these groups in a new government and try and make the best of it that we can, or face them down and risk civil war in which we might collapse, we might get killed, and we know Joe Biden or the rest of the international community is never going to ride to our rescue if things go really bad. If they decide that they need to make amends with these guys in one form or another, and then just try to cut the best deal they can going forward, I think it's going to be very hard for us to say, okay, that's your choice, but now we're going to act in Iraq to go after the perpetrators of this attack on Khatami. We're going to be the ones to redeem Iraqi sovereignty and the Iraqi state, because I think down that road, it's just offers too many opportunities for the Iranians and their proxies to escalate without sufficient U.S. response or preparation, that we're in this for the long term. And the Iraqi government will be left there alone trying to fend for itself and get humiliated and embarrassed when the Iranians and their friends do escalate. So, we'll have to see what happens. But like I said, I don't think the Biden administration is not going to be deeply engaged in this other than condemning. And therefore, I think there's going to be some kind of deal cut inside of Iraq, the way it always gets cut, in a way that probably favors the one country that, as Danny says, comes to work every day and has a much deeper stake, because they live right next door and are going to be there forever in the future of Iraq, than the United States does, despite all of our sacrifices there. What I would like to see is, and I find astonishing, is that we can know Iran attacked American troops in southern Syria with the intent to kill, and that there is nothing, not a peep really, from the United States. We sanctioned some Iranian people in Iran responsible for drones, but I think that is just insufficient, because these attacks are going to continue and continue, and the Iranians will believe sanctions, they can pay that price. They've seen that for the last 10 years, that they can endure. but serious, sustained American military responses, at least to their assaults on U.S. troops, U.S. personnel, U.S. positions, is something that they haven't ever seen. So I think you use this attack upon Khatami as a reason to go back to the Tanf attack and say, okay, we said we we're going to respond at a time and place of our choosing. We are now figure out what your targets are and go after the Iranian target and punish the hell out of it. And I think that sets us up perfectly well in advance of any nuclear negotiations. The Iranians, throughout the history of these negotiations, the last decade, they always fight and kill their enemies and American positions at the same time that they're negotiating with us. And for some reason, we seem to have this complete faith that if we're in a negotiation, it means we have to stand down everywhere else when we're being attacked and not respond for fear of subverting these negotiations. I think that is a formula for failure, not success. I think it exudes cravenness and weakness to the Iranians. And I think that's the formula that needs to be changed. And I think the attack on Khatami coming so soon after the Tanf attack gives us some kind of cover to really make a statement here before the JCPOA negotiations resume in a few weeks.
Thanks, John. Danny, over to you for the last word and sage advice on what we should be doing.
Well, first of all, amen to everything John said. I couldn't agree with him more. You know, we have left so much unanswered and for some reason fail to understand the implications of that, despite the fact that we've been down this road so many times before. If only someone like John were making decisions in the government, I would feel a hell of a lot better. I guess where I would leave people, you know, we have had a conversation over the last 20 years since 9/11 about the wars that America fights. And, you know, if you don't want to fight wars, and I think none of us like fighting wars. If you don't want to fight wars, you need a policy and you need diplomacy and you need to use economic tools. And if you are unwilling to, you know, not to abuse the phrase I introduced, but if you're not willing to come to work every day, and we don't in the Middle East, we absolutely don't in Iraq, then you're going to have a problem. And everything escalates. So sure, you know, the Iranians are ankle biters. You know, they're coming, they're bothering you yet. They kill one person here, one person there, little assassination, little terrorism, you know, little naughty behavior. But eventually, because we allow them to believe it is the case, they step over the line. And then we are forced to act. And we are forced to act on a foundation of inattention. We don't have people on the ground. We don't have allies on the ground. We haven't built up civil society. We haven't helped build institutions. We've just thrown up our hands and said, oh, Iraq, it's always going to suck and it always will. So why bother? And, you know, this is not foreign policy. This is how we end up in wars. So for all those who hate wars, remember, the alternative is diplomacy and policy, right? And we are missing those things, not just on Iran, of course, but on Iraq as well.
Well, thank you both so much. That was perfectly timed, Danny, to get us right to our 12 o'clock end time. Really excellent analysis and recommendations for doing the work, growing the flower garden, weeding the weed patch, and all sorts of other great metaphors that I look forward to hearing you use in future conversations. Thank you again both so much, John and Danny. It's been a really terrific conversation. Thanks to all of you who joined us for this Zoom. Enjoy the rest of your Friday and have a good weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, Blaise. Thanks, Danny.
Take care. Thanks, John. Thanks, Blaise. Bye, guys.